Yeah, I mean, I always say that a healthy hoof is one that allows the horse to move over all surfaces comfortably, without protection. And I know that that is a tall ask for some horses. But my main gauge for a healthy hoof is comfort. So a
Mm,
hoof can look beautiful, but if that horse can't like walk over a, concrete aisle without
mm,
being sore, there's something wrong.
yeah.
But if we're kind of doing the whole like ideal textbook sort of appearance, I want to see a nice wide frog. I want to see heel angle that somewhat, pretty much matches the angle of the front of the hoof, the dorsal wall angle. I want to see that the hoof doesn't have a lot of flaring. I want to see a nice tight white line connection where the sole and the wall meet. I want to see, pretty good concavity of sole and a good collateral groove depth. So like when you're picking out your horse's foot,
Mhm.
those grooves next to the frog, if those are really shallow, you probably have a really thin sole.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, and there's other ways to tell if you have a thin sole, but that's one of the biggest giveaways.
Mm,
So things like that. But my biggest gauge is like if there's a horse that's shod, if it loses a shoe, is it suddenly unable to walk?
mhm.
Like it probably doesn't have the healthiest feet. Granted, of course, there's more factors that go into that. Like if they haven't felt the ground in a while, they're gonna probably feel the ground.
Or
But
if
I
they
want
get a clip lodged up there.
yeah, right, exactly. Like, it's not like a blanket statement I can make, but I want, no matter what the hoof looks like, I want that hoof to be able to perform
Mm,
in the way that the owner wants it to.
yep.
But I actually have a few free webinars on YouTube that look
Mm,
at like what a healthy foot looks like. If it's
sweet.
harder to talk about in a podcast because we don't have the visual
Mhm.
aspect.
Yeah. Um, how do conformation faults, like if you have a horse that's toed in, or you have a horse that's a little over at the knee, or something like that, how does that contribute to hoof conformation? Is it the hoof conformation that has contributed to the conformation fault? Chicken or the egg sort of thing? Like, how do you go about dealing with a horse with a leg conformation fault?
Yeah, I mean that can be like you said, chicken or the egg. Like it can be hard to figure out, is it the hoof or like a kind of a poor balance and trimming that's leading to these like wonky conformational issues, or is it a past injury or literal conformation that's leading to hoof deformation issues? So typically my approach to like an angular limb deformity where there's some joint down the limb or there's some part of the limb that's just deviating from the norm,
Mhm.
um, is, you'll see when you pick up the foot, I guess I'm basing this on a bare foot because you're going to be able to see the wear on that foot much better. But if you pick up the foot, a lot of times you'll see that there's a steep side of the foot and a
Mhm.
flared side. And this isn't like I learned this from Pete Ramey. He's a farrier down in Georgia. But there'll be a steep side of the foot, and often that side is the side that's getting more pressure, more loading. And then there'll be a flared side of the foot that isn't getting as much weight throughout this, like a loading throughout the
Mhm.
phase of the stride. So if I have a horse that's very toed in, depending on where that deviation is coming from, of course, but let's say it's coming from the fetlock.
Mhm.
A lot of times we'll have a very steep outer wall, and then you'll have and a lot of times that outer wall will be worn right to
Mhm.
sole. And then we'll have this inner wall that has height above sole, but it also have flare. Like
Mhm.
it will be angled away from the coronary band if you're looking at it from the front.
Okay.
Um, in those cases, a lot, you can't force, just like we're talking about high-low, we can't force these limbs to be straight. And if you do, you're going to affect their joints and ligaments in a way that the horse is not going to be happy.
Mhm.
So a lot of times it's managing their wear so that their wear doesn't end up causing more problems throughout the cycle.
Mhm.
So if they have a very worn outer wall and a very flared, inner wall, that will get worse and worse and worse throughout a longer cycle because of
Mhm.
their conformation. conformation. So a lot of times what I'm doing is just working on bringing that inner wall in and down to match the outer wear. I don't even have to touch the outer wall because it's already, you know, the hoof's already wearing it for
job.
me.
Yeah.
But yeah, and then, you know, if you have a horse that toes out, you have the exact opposite. Like you have inner wall that's really steep and worn to sole, and an outer wall that's higher and flared. And you're just kind of managing that. And a lot of times, like I'll give owners an old rasp and I'll say like, hey, once a week, just like rasp down this inner wall. You'll find that those horses are a lot straighter throughout the cycle and they don't have that exaggerated wear pattern if owners are kind of staying on top of it. If you have a horse that's like over at the knee, one thing that I've seen, and I don't want to bash this because I think it's a good thing that there's a lot of owner education on things like phalangeal alignment or hoof pastern access or palmar angle, is that there's this big push for having like a straight hoof pastern access from the fetlock through the hoof. And that's sort of like the ideal. It's said to like take the pressure off the tendon, the DDFT, and the back of the limb. But if you have a horse that's like very over at the knee or who has like long sloping pasterns, I find that if you take their toe back, and this is just something others have taught me. I'm not saying this is like I just made this up. But also I saw it in practice as well as I started trimming more and more. If you take their toe back to what might be ideal based on a textbook, like a horse that's over at the knee, if their breakover is too far back, a lot of times they'll like wobble their knee when they stand. Like if you have a horse that's very over at the knee and you're like, oh, it's like they can't lock their knee. You know, it sounds a little taboo, but like leave their toe a little longer. Like all of a sudden they're like, oh, I can stand and this is not unstable and I'm not tripping anymore. And you think the opposite a lot of times. You're like, oh, if they're tripping, it's because they have a long toe. And you know, horses that have a long sloping pastern, it's sometimes like really hard to get their hoof kind of like underneath their limb. It's like so far forward that then they're struggling with tripping or they're struggling with having good angles. And that's where bringing the breakover back more might help. So really it can depend on the individual case and obviously where this is stemming from. Is it like you said, like truly a conformational fault, or is it like, hey, they've had like no hoof care for like 4 years.
Yeah.
And like, as soon as we start trimming them, it's like, oh, hey, it wasn't conformation after all. And that's harder to say anything without seeing like an individual case. But yeah, there's definitely, to me, like the wear patterns of the hoof tell you so much of like where that movement is happening throughout stride.
And do you think proper riding and proper training of the horse, not for competition, but for biomechanical movement, will help the balance of the hoof in the long run? Or do you think the hoof needs to be fixed before we even think about, you know, the biomechanical aspect of the riding?
I mean, I think both are incredibly important, but I will say that there have been times when I've had cases where I just cannot get the feet to do what I want in terms of, you know, how they wear or how they, like we're talking about high-low, I can't get them better. And once their training changes or once they get body work or once they're in a more intentional program where they're actually working on like straightness through both sides of their body, their feet kind of fix themselves. And then it makes my job easier. I actually have a podcast interview that I talked to Shannon Peters. And she is just an incredible dressage rider. She's Stephen Peters' wife. And she obviously has an incredible amount of experience with riding. And when I was talking on that episode, I also had her farrier on as another guest. And she was saying that, you know, Shannon will take in these horses for training and they'll come with like these wonky feet. And throughout their training, as they work through this dressage training with Shannon, all of a sudden their high-low is gone or like completely improved. Or their feet will stop flaring laterally like crazy, like to the, you know, there all these weird wear patterns will suddenly go away because they're landing evenly and they're loading evenly and they're not, you know, only going their preferred lead because they're on a trail and nobody's asking them to actually, you know, change leads or go a different direction. Right. So I think that riding can play such a huge role, but I mean, there's so much that goes into that variable wise, like, you know, how is their saddle fit or Or do they have some kind of injury higher up where they're compensating? They might not feel lame, but they're compensating how they're picking up the canner or something, and that's going to affect their feet.
Yep.
So yeah, I think that the training plays such a huge role. But obviously there's all those other factors too.
So